There's a kind of invisibility that comes with certain jobs. You move through rooms carrying plates, refilling glasses, clearing away the remnants of meals and conversations. People talk around you as if you weren't there, as if the uniform you wear has made you disappear, transformed you into furniture, into background, into nothing worth noticing. I know this invisibility well. I lived inside it for years, moving through the spaces of the wealthy and powerful, like a ghost they could see but chose not to acknowledge. And I learned things in that invisibility, things people never would have told me if they had remembered I was human. Secrets spoken in plain sight, cruelties exchanged like small talk, judgments passed as casually as salt across a table. This is a story about assumptions, about the boxes we put people in and the doors we lock behind them, and about what happens when someone steps out of the box we've built for them, and suddenly we have to see them as they really are. Come sit with me. I want to tell you about a night that changed everything. My name is Maylin Carter. The name itself tells a story, doesn't it? Two worlds pressed together, neither one quite fitting, both of them mine. My mother was born in Osaka, the daughter of a literature professor and a woman who painted watercolors of the harbor at dawn. She grew up surrounded by books and beauty, learning to see the world through poetry and art, learning that there were always multiple ways to understand any moment. She came to America for graduate school, following a passion for comparative literature that her father had planted in her like a seed, and she fell in love with a man from a small town in Ohio, a carpenter's son who had never traveled farther than the state line, who worked with his hands and spoke simply and directly, who looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. My father used to tell me the story of their first meeting. She was in the university library struggling to reach a book on the top shelf. He was there fixing a broken window latch. He didn't ask if she needed help. He just walked over, pulled down the book, and handed it to her with a small bow that made her laugh. "I didn't know Americans bowed," she told him. "We don't," he said, "but you looked like someone who deserved it." They married young, against the gentle objections of both families. Not out of prejudice exactly, but out of concern. How would their worlds fit together? What language would they speak at home? How would their children belong? I was their answer, and their question too. Growing up, I moved between languages the way other children move between rooms. Japanese with my mother, English with my father, and something in between that belonged only to us. A hybrid tongue full of words borrowed from both sides, phrases that made sense only in our small kitchen, our crowded living room, our world of three. We spent summers in Osaka, staying with my grandparents in their small house near the university. The house smelled of incense and old books and my grandmother's cooking, that particular combination of soy sauce and sesame and something green and growing from the tiny garden she kept by the back door. My grandfather would take me for walks through the campus, pointing out the buildings where he had taught, the bench where he had proposed to my grandmother, the tree that had been planted the year my mother was born. He recited poetry as we walked, mixing classical Japanese verse with translations of Wordsworth and Whitman, teaching me that beauty had no nationality, that words could cross any border if they carried truth. "Language is a bridge," he told me once, as we watched the boats in the harbor. "But most people are afraid to cross it. They stand on their own shore and shout across the water, wondering why no one understands them." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I kept his words, stored them away like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. Those summers shaped me. The language settled into my bones, became part of how I thought and dreamed and understood the world. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw my father's eyes, his reddish-brown hair, his face that belonged to cornfields and county fairs. In Japan, I was too American. In America, I was something people couldn't quite place. I learned early that people see what they expect to see, and what they expected when they looked at me was never quite what I was. I started waitressing at La Fontaine the summer after my junior year of college. It was the kind of restaurant where a single meal cost more than my monthly rent. White tablecloths starched so stiff they crackled when you laid them. Crystal glasses that chimed when you touched them, even gently. A sommelier who could tell you which hillside a grape had grown on just by tasting the wine, and who enjoyed demonstrating this at every opportunity. The dining room was hushed and elegant, with tall windows that looked out on a garden courtyard. The walls were hung with original artwork, not prints, pieces that probably cost more than my education. Everything was designed to make the guests feel important, special, elevated above the ordinary world. The clientele matched the setting, business executives celebrating deals, politicians entertaining donors, old money families observing traditions that went back generations. New money couples trying to learn which fork to use. They all moved through the world with the confidence of those who had never been told no. who had never wondered if there would be enough, who had never had to choose between the electric bill and groceries. I needed the job. My mother had gotten sick that spring, a diagnosis that came like a door slamming shut on everything we'd thought was certain. The doctors talked about treatment plans and survival rates and clinical trials. The bills started arriving, thick envelopes full of numbers that made my head spin. My father had taken leave from his construction job to care for her. He sat by her bed during the day, holding her hand, reading to her from the books she loved, but someone had to pay for the medications, the specialists, the small apartment they had moved to when the house became too much. So I put on the black dress and the sensible shoes, pulled my hair back in a neat bun, and learned to become invisible. The training was thorough. We learned how to carry 3 plates at once, how to open wine bottles without making a sound, how to clear a table so smoothly the guests barely noticed we were there. We learned the menu in French and English, learned which dishes paired with which wines, learned the names of regular customers and their preferences. But the real training happened on the floor, in the countless small moments when we learned what it meant to serve. We learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to refill water glasses when they were 2/3 empty, to bring the check before it was requested, but not so quickly that anyone felt rushed, to appear and disappear without being noticed, to make the experience seamless for the guests. What they didn't teach us, because they didn't need to, was how to endure the small cruelties of being overlooked. The conversations that happened as if we weren't there, the assumptions made about our intelligence, our education, our worth. The way certain men looked at us, or didn't look at us, depending on what suited them. "That waitress is pretty enough," a man said once, loud enough for me to hear. "But you can tell she's not very smart. Just look at her eyes, vacant." I was carrying his dessert at the time. I set it down with perfect composure, smiled my professional smile, and asked if there was anything else he needed. He didn't remember saying it, I'm sure. It was nothing to him, a moment's idle cruelty, forgotten before the chocolate mousse arrived. But I remember still. You develop a thick skin in this work. You learn to let the words slide past you, to focus on the job, to remember that their opinions don't define you. But sometimes, late at night, when the restaurant was closed and I was walking home through empty streets, I would replay the things I'd heard, the casual dismissals, the jokes at our expense, the way they talked about us like we were less than human. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew who I was, even if they didn't. But it's hard to keep believing that when the world keeps telling you otherwise. The Tanaka delegation arrived on a Thursday evening in October. I remember because the leaves had just started to turn, and the light coming through the restaurant's windows had that golden quality that makes everything look like a memory. The air outside smelled of wood smoke and decay, that particular autumn scent that means summer is really gone and the long cold is coming. The manager had been preparing for days. Mr. Devereaux, a French transplant who ran La Fontaine with military precision, had called special meetings to review protocols for serving Japanese business guests, the proper way to present business cards, the importance of hierarchy and seating arrangements, the cultural expectations around service and formality. "These are serious people," he told us, his accent thickening with emphasis. "Serious money, serious consequences if we fail. Every detail must be perfect." There were 5 of them. Mr. Tanaka himself, the CEO of one of Japan's largest technology firms, silver-haired and dignified, with the bearing of a man accustomed to respect. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step was considered. His second-in-command, a younger man named Sato, sharp-eyed and watchful, was clearly the one who handled the details while Tanaka handled the vision. And 3 others whose names I would learn later, executives who had flown across the ocean for this meeting. They were here to finalize a major investment deal with Harrison Partners, one of our most important clients. Tens of millions of dollars were at stake, the kind of money that could build factories, fund research, change the trajectory of entire industries. I was assigned to their private dining room, a space we reserved for our most prestigious guests. The room was intimate, elegantly appointed, with a view of the city lights that made the world outside seem like a painting. Dark wood paneling absorbed sound, making conversations feel private, protected. I would be their sole server for the evening, responsible for ensuring that every detail was perfect. I introduced myself with a small bow, as I'd been trained. My Japanese wanted to rise to my lips, wanted to greet them properly, but I held it back. This wasn't about me. This was about being invisible, being perfect, being what they expected and nothing more. Mr. Tanaka nodded politely. The others barely glanced at me. I was, as expected, invisible. And then I went to get their drinks, and they began to talk. They assumed, of course, that I couldn't understand them. Why would they assume otherwise? I looked nothing like my mother, nothing like the image they held in their minds of what a Japanese person should look like. My name tag said, Mei Lin, but plenty of American parents gave their children exotic-sounding names. There was nothing about me that suggested I could follow their rapid, idiomatic Japanese, the kind that comes from a lifetime of living inside a language. So they spoke freely. At first, it was just business, discussion of the deal, the terms they would accept, and those they wouldn't, the American partners they were about to meet. Mr. Tanaka expressed some concerns about the timeline, wondering if the Americans were rushing toward closure without proper consideration of the complexities. Sato suggested a modification to the profit-sharing structure that would protect their interest more effectively. I moved around the room, pouring water, adjusting place settings, arranging the flowers in the centerpiece so they caught the candlelight. My face stayed neutral, professionally pleasant, revealing nothing. My Japanese was rusty from years of not using it regularly, but it came back quickly, like muscle memory, like riding a bicycle through streets I hadn't visited in years. The words settled into my ears, and I felt something stir in my chest, a complicated mix of recognition and longing. This was my mother's language, my grandfather's poetry, my summers on the harbor watching the boats come and go. This was part of me that had been sleeping, and now it was waking up. Then the Americans arrived. Harrison Partners sent 3 representatives, Tom Harrison himself, the founder and CEO, a man in his 60s with the easy confidence of inherited wealth. His smile was practiced, his handshake firm, his eyes always calculating behind their genial expression. His son Michael, who would be taking over the firm within the next few years, and who carried himself with the impatience of someone waiting for his turn. He checked his phone constantly, even during conversations, as if something more important might be happening somewhere else. And their legal counsel, a woman named Patricia, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She watched everything, said little, and wrote in a small leather notebook whenever she thought no one was looking. The 2 groups exchanged pleasantries, that careful dance of international business. Handshakes. Business cards presented with both hands, as was proper. Tom had clearly been coached, though his movements were slightly awkward, like a man performing a ritual he didn't fully understand. Compliments about the flight, the hotel, the city, and then they sat down to dinner and the real conversation began. It started subtly, as these things always do. The Americans were trying too hard, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, talking over each other in their eagerness to impress. Michael, especially, seemed determined to demonstrate his expertise, peppering his conversation with statistics and projections that he clearly expected to dazzle. He used words like synergy and leverage and paradigm shift, the vocabulary of business school, not of actual business. Mr. Tanaka listened politely, his face revealing nothing. He had mastered the art of the pleasant expression, the small nod that could mean agreement or could mean nothing at all. But in the pauses, when the Americans were distracted with their meals or their wine, he would exchange glances with his colleagues, small comments in Japanese, too quick and quiet for anyone else to catch. He talks much but says little, Sato murmured at one point, referring to Michael. The presentation is polished, another executive observed. But there is no substance beneath it, like a beautiful box with nothing inside. Patience, Mr. Tanaka replied softly. The father built something real. Perhaps the son will learn, or perhaps he won't, and we will learn something useful about the future of this partnership. I kept my expression neutral, refilling glasses, clearing plates. But I was listening. I was always listening. As the evening progressed, the comments became more pointed. The Americans were drinking heavily, their voices growing louder, their judgments more careless. Michael made a joke about Japanese work culture that landed badly, something about robots and efficiency that revealed more about his assumptions than he intended. Tom tried to salvage it with a story about his golf game that went on too long and ended nowhere. Patricia wrote something in her notebook, her expression unreadable. Sato leaned over to another executive and said, in Japanese, "Do they think we're fools? This one treats us like we should be grateful for the opportunity to give them our money, like we are children who don't understand the value of what we have." The other man nodded slightly. Americans, they see the world through their own reflection. They cannot imagine that others might see differently. I felt something tighten in my chest, not just at the criticism, which was fair, but at the sadness underneath it. These were businessmen who had traveled thousands of miles, who had built companies and created jobs and navigated complexities I could barely imagine. And here they were, being treated like props in someone else's success story. But there was something else too, a recognition. Because I had been treated the same way, hadn't I? Overlooked, underestimated, dismissed before I had the chance to speak. The invisibility I wore as a waitress was not so different from the box these men were being put in. Different assumptions, same result. We were all being seen as less than we were. The moment came near the end of the main course. Michael was talking about market expansion, leaning back in his chair, wine glass in hand, completely certain of his own brilliance. He had the look of someone who had never been seriously contradicted, who mistook his confidence for competence and his privilege for merit. The Asian market is really about understanding what they want to hear, he said, gesturing broadly with his free hand. You tell them what they want to hear, and they sign on the line. Simple as that. It's all about relationship, right? Making them feel respected, even if you don't actually... He caught himself, laughed. Well, you know what I mean. I saw Mr. Tanaka's expression flicker, just for a moment. A tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in the jaw. Then it was gone, smoothed over by decades of discipline. He had heard worse, surely, had learned to let such things pass without response, to pick his battles, to keep his eyes on the larger goal. But Sato couldn't resist. He thinks we're children, he said in Japanese, his voice low, but carrying in this quiet room. Smile and nod for the Americans, sign their papers, go home like good little partners. He doesn't even bother to hide his contempt. The other Japanese executives nodded almost imperceptibly. Even Mr. Tanaka's mouth twitched, though whether in agreement or warning, I couldn't tell. I had reached a decision point, the kind that comes sometimes in life, where you can stay invisible and safe, or you can step forward and risk everything. I could finish clearing the plates, bring the dessert course, collect my tip, and go home. No one would ever know what I had heard. No one would expect anything different. But something had shifted inside me over those hours. Something was rising up, demanding to be heard. I thought about my mother lying in her hospital bed, watching Japanese dramas on her laptop because they reminded her of home. I thought about my grandfather, who had spent his life teaching literature to students who would go on to lead companies and governments, who had taught me that language was a bridge between worlds if you had the courage to walk across it. I thought about what it meant to be invisible, and what it might mean to be seen. I stepped forward to clear a plate, and as I leaned between Mr. Tanaka and Sato, I said very quietly in Japanese, "Forgive my intrusion, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Perhaps I could help clarify if you would permit me." The room went absolutely still. Sato's face went pale. The other executives froze, their eyes darting between me and Mr. Tanaka, trying to calculate what I had heard, how much damage had been done. Michael was still talking, oblivious to the shift in the room, but Tom had noticed the sudden tension and was looking around with growing confusion. Mr. Tanaka turned to look at me. Really look, perhaps for the first time all evening. His eyes were sharp, assessing, taking in details he had overlooked before. The shape of my face, the way I held myself, the steadiness in my gaze that suggested I was not afraid. "You speak Japanese," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. My mother is from Osaka. I spent my summers there as a child with my grandparents." "What neighborhood?" "Near the university, Toyonaka." Something shifted in his expression, a softening perhaps, or a deepening of interest. "I know Toyonaka. I lectured there once, many years ago, on the future of technology in Asian markets." "Your grandfather was a professor?" "Of literature. He passed away 5 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." He paused. "Please, sit down." "Sir, I couldn't. I insist." He pulled out the empty chair beside him. "Please." The Americans had stopped talking now, aware that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what. Michael's expression was confused, annoyed. Tom was watching with the careful attention of a man who recognized that the ground had shifted beneath him. I hesitated, looking toward the door, toward the safety of my invisible role. Mr. Devereaux would be furious. There were rules about fraternizing with guests, about maintaining professional distance. This could cost me my job. But Mr. Tanaka was waiting, and something in his face told me that this was important, that this moment mattered in ways I was only beginning to understand. I sat down. What followed was the most remarkable conversation of my life. Mr. Tanaka asked about my mother, my grandparents, my summers in Osaka. He knew the neighborhood where my grandfather had taught, had even attended a lecture there once, years ago, during a conference on education and technology. We talked about the campus, about the old library with its wooden shelves and the smell of aging paper. We talked about the waterfront, about the way the light fell on the harbor in the early morning, about the small restaurant near the university that made the best okonomiyaki in the city. "Yamamoto's," I said. "The old woman who runs it. She used to give me extra bonito flakes because she said I was too skinny." Mr. Tanaka smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. Mrs. Yamamoto, she's still there, still telling everyone they're too skinny. I visit every time I'm in Osaka. The other Japanese executives relaxed, their wariness giving way to something warmer. Sato even laughed when I told a story about getting lost in the subway system as a child, wandering for hours until a kind station attendant helped me find my way back. The subway is a maze, he admitted. I still get lost sometimes, and I've lived in Tokyo for 30 years. We talked for nearly an hour about Japan and America, about bridging cultures, about what it meant to carry two worlds inside you and never quite belong to either one, about my mother's illness, my father's devotion, my own uncertain path through a world that couldn't quite figure out where to put me. Tom Harrison watched all of this with an expression I couldn't read. His son Michael looked annoyed, sensing that he had lost control of the conversation, but not understanding why or how to get it back. Finally, Mr. Tanaka turned to Tom. "Your waitress," he said, "has just taught me something important about your country." Tom blinked. "She has. We came here with assumptions. We expected to be treated a certain way, and when we were treated that way, we assumed it was all Americans had to offer." He glanced at me, then back at Tom. But here is someone who carries two worlds inside her, who serves with grace while holding knowledge we never thought to look for, who could have stayed silent, could have let us leave with our assumptions intact, but chose instead to bridge a gap we didn't know existed. He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. "This is what I want in a partnership. Not people who tell me what I want to hear, but people who surprise me, who see beyond the obvious, who have the courage to speak even when silence would be easier." He looked at Michael, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was clear. "Do you understand what I'm saying, young man?" Michael's face had gone red. Yes, I think so." "Good." Mr. Tanaka nodded. "Then perhaps we can begin again. Not as Americans and Japanese, not as investors and partners, but as people. People who see each other clearly." The deal was signed 3 weeks later, on terms that were fairer than the original proposal. Mr. Tanaka insisted on it. He also insisted that Harrison Partners implement new training for their executives, focused on cultural competency and the dangers of assumption. I learned all of this later in a letter that arrived at my apartment on a cold November evening. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with the Tanaka Corporation logo embossed on the flap. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Tanaka himself, along with a business card and an invitation. The note was in Japanese, and it took me a moment to translate, my eyes blurring with tears as I read. "Dear Mei Lin, I have thought often about our conversation that evening, about the courage it took to speak, and the grace with which you did so. You reminded me that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, and that the people we overlook are often the ones with the most to teach us. I have taken the liberty of speaking with your mother's doctors. Her treatment will be covered in full. Please do not refuse this gift. It is not charity, it is gratitude, and gratitude has a right to be expressed. I understand you are studying international business at university. When you graduate, there will be a position waiting for you at our American headquarters, if you want it. Not because of that evening, but because of who you are. A bridge between worlds, a person who sees. Your grandfather would be proud of you. I know I am. With respect and admiration, Hiroshi Tanaka." I sat on my small couch for a long time, holding the letter, watching the light change outside my window, thinking about invisibility, about assumptions, about the courage it takes to be seen. That was 12 years ago. My mother recovered. She's in remission now, painting watercolors again, teaching Japanese to children at the community center. My father built her a studio in the backyard, with big windows that let in the morning light, and she paints the harbor at Osaka from memory, the way her mother used to. I did take the position at Tanaka Corporation. I've risen through the ranks, led negotiations, built bridges between companies and cultures and people who thought they had nothing in common. My work has taken me to Tokyo and London and Sao Paulo, to boardrooms and factories, and the small restaurants where deals are really made over shared meals and honest conversation. Mr. Tanaka passed away 3 years ago, peacefully, surrounded by his family. I flew to Osaka for the funeral, stood in the temple where his ancestors were honored, and said goodbye to a man who had changed my life with a single act of seeing. His grandson runs the company. Now, and sometimes when we're talking, I catch a glimpse of Hiroshi in the way he tilts his head, or the questions he asks. "He saw something in you," the grandson said once, "something no one else was looking for." "He was willing to look," I replied. "That's the only difference. He was willing to really see." "The fire is burning low now?" I should add another log, but there's something peaceful about watching the embers glow, about sitting in the dimness and letting the memories settle. I've been thinking about my grandfather's words, about language being a bridge, about how most people stand on their own shore and shout across the water, wondering why no one understands them. We all have the capacity to be bridges. We all carry multitudes, parts of ourselves that others don't expect, depths that go unseen until someone takes the time to look. The question is whether we have the courage to show those parts, whether we're willing to speak when silence would be easier. So here's what I want to leave you with. Don't assume you know someone's story. The person serving your coffee might speak 5 languages. The janitor might have a PhD. The waitress might understand every word you're saying, even the ones you think are private. And don't assume you have to stay invisible. You have bridges to build that only you can build. Speak. Be seen. Find the courage to show the world who you really are. The fire's almost out now, but somewhere, my grandmother's watercolors still hang on a wall in Osaka. And somewhere in my chest, my grandfather's poetry still lives, waiting to be spoken. We carry our worlds inside us. All we have to do is let them out. Good night, friend. May you find the courage to be seen tomorrow. The most beautiful things are hidden in plain sight. We just have to be willing to look.